Thank you, Tamar. Thank you at home who are viewing the lecture, and welcome back to those who were here last week. Welcome to those who are joining us for the first time. As Tamar said, this is the second of a four-part series based around sites, places in the city of New York associated with Jewish life in the history of the Jewish community. We began indeed with the idea of points of arrival, and today's lecture will be devoted to what I'll call urban spaces. Indeed, as Tamar said, I would like to go with you to a few places around New York City to remind us of how it was that this massive arrival of Jews in New York over the course of almost an entire century or more of constant Jewish migration, how did they change the life of the city in the places where they lived, and also vice versa? How did the city change them? And a fancier way of saying that is, how did they inscribe their existence on the landscape, on the urban landscape? How did their lives become etched into the fabric of the city? Sometimes their lives, sometimes their deaths. And without further ado, those of you who were here last week or who saw the recording in the interim will recall that we ended last week with one of the points of arrival, which was Brooklyn, and specifically I referred to the neighborhood of Brownsville, if you will, in the Yiddish version. And that's where we will start off today. The neighborhood known as Brownsville became very, very heavily populated by Jewish immigrants already early in the first years of the 20th century, but even more so in the years starting around 1909, 1910, and so forth, and remained a heavily Jewish neighborhood for several decades. During the course of time, the neighborhood began to absorb a large number of African American migrants coming from the American South or elsewhere, and for a while in the 1920s and 1930s in particular, you could say that it was a site where Jews, other European immigrants, and African American residents shared to some extent the urban space. Brownsville, like other lower class urban neighborhoods, was very densely populated. These neighborhoods tended no longer to be places of manufacturing work. Centers for work had moved elsewhere, but we're talking about the neighborhood as a place, obviously, of residence, but also a place for shopping, a place for leisure, a place where there were so many fellow immigrants from more or less the same culture that it gave a sense of, to the people living there, of living in a majority culture, as if everyone in the world, if you could imagine it, everyone around you was rather similar in background and so forth. The literary critic Alfred Kazin, who also grew up in Brownsville, only one of a number of future intellectual gurus who were children growing up in Brownsville, He remembered Brownsville, in fact, just that way, that a place where one felt at home, secure, very warm. And the trip over to Manhattan was a trip to the other world, the world where there were non-Jews, the world where there was American culture, whereas Brownsville to him represented something else. Brownsville was the place that there were so many people living, and we'll speak specifically about the Jewish residents for now. There were so many people living that, of course, you had a wide disparity of the roads taken in their lives. I mentioned intellectual gurus, but of course, Brownsville was also home turf to the Jewish underworld, Jewish mobsters, some of whom became famous for forming what became known as Murder Incorporated, a hit gang led by the likes of Louis Lepke Buchhalter or Abe Kid Twist Relis. They were responsible for between 400 and 1,000 murders around New York City. And the prosecutor who gained his legal reputation by trying to take them down was none other than Thomas Dewey, the future governor of New York State and a candidate for the American presidency. Brownsville was also, like other neighborhoods, a place where there were local heroes for whom one had an affinity, a kinship, a link. I gave you here a couple of examples of Jewish stars of the boxing ring of those days, Benny Leonard and Barney Ross, shortened from Rossovsky. So you had, as it were, almost a world unto itself, from the corner grocery shop to the parks and places of leisure to organized crime, to pretty much everything. This is, I think, one of the characteristics of these heavily, densely inhabited tenement districts where an entire world, as it were, could exist. And of course, people come and go. People move into neighborhoods, people move out of neighborhoods. Brownsville, in the end, as we will see, is a kind of a transient site. Jews were heavily concentrated there up until the 1920s and 30s, and then they begin to filter out, to move elsewhere. But did they leave their mark? And here, let me point out some of the more physical and visible reminders of Jewish Brownsville. The first instance I will show you here, and we'll come back to something else towards the end. The first instance I'm going to show you here, as you see, is a monument, a memorial to Jewish servicemen who fell in the First World War in combat, and they were memorialized in this heavily Jewish neighborhood, in this monument, this memorial, which has fairly recently been restored. It's in the middle of a small park in the shape of a triangle known as Zion Triangle Park. The name Zion Park is also no accident. The street names and the parks and so forth are ways in which the presence of a particular community or particular ethnic group came to be inscribed, literally inscribed, on the urban landscape. Zion Square, or Zion Triangle, is formed by 3 avenues: Pitkin Avenue, New York Avenue, and Legion Avenue in Brownsville. The the example of Brownsville reminds us of the fact that in the city of New York, Jews were in fact spread out in various places, not just in the legendary Lower East Side, but of course we cannot skip the Lower East Side. The Lower East Side is the most famous, almost the iconic site of a heavy Jewish concentration. As you see here from this scene, street scene from the Lower East Side of Manhattan, fairly typical street of tenements. There's a very large sign in the foreground in English and in Yiddish advertising a half-price sale for a business that went bankrupt and was going out of business and had to sell off its stock. I would perhaps add in parenthesis here a remark going back to what I mentioned earlier, how Jews inscribed themselves, as it were, or lent their character to the urban space that they occupied, but also vice versa, how the city, how the process of becoming at home in New York also began to change them and to give shape and character to the Jewish community. And I'll mention this here in passing with regard to the sign. The sign, as you see, is bilingual. The English more or less goes without saying. The Yiddish, however, I should point out, is a brand of New York Yiddish, incorporating a good number of English words written in Yiddish. For example, the main advertising words, men's furnishing. All right, men's furnishing, you know, those are not words that exist in Yiddish, and yet we have them here in the Yiddish sign. And that's not the only example. So that this beginning of cultural mixing between the street language of the city, that is English, and the street language and the home language of the residents, of the immigrants, that is to say Yiddish, here the influence of the one on the other begins to be something rather clear. Neighborhoods where people live obviously are not just about shops and factories, it's also about families and tremendously about children growing up in these tenement areas, these slum districts, children going to school, children in one of the pictures here, I'm going to use my pointer now and point out to the picture in the upper left of the slide. These are children lined up to go to the Brooklyn Public Library Children's Branch, something which in the age of the internet probably you would not see anymore, but this goes back to the beginning of the 20th century. So it's a place of schools, it's a place of libraries, it's a place of play, but it's also, let me just give you another taste of that. Children playing in the streets, and children in all kinds of places. Some of the places in which you found children in large numbers in the immigrant era was in fact in orphanages. The Jewish community, like other communities in urban America, set up these orphanages to house children in kind of boarding schools, full boarding or partial boarding, for indigent families, poor families who could not afford to keep their children at home. Only a certain percentage of the children who lived in these, in this case, Jewish orphanages, only a small percentage of them had actually been orphaned of both parents. Some of them had been orphaned of one parent, but a large proportion, sometimes half, of the children in these orphanages were in fact sent to live in these institutions because their families, their parents, both of whom were alive, simply could not afford to keep them at home. And so this is something that we have to remember about the onset of the mass immigration and how did their lives play out. The fact that in the end, the second generation, and even more so the third generation, coming after the immigration, did succeed quite well in climbing the ladder into the middle class should, of course, be taken into account. And historians are always asking questions such as, how is it that these poor immigrants did, in fact, make it possible for their children to escape poverty to the large extent? Nevertheless, the poverty was very real, and it was there at the very beginning. Certainly that aspect of life did color the life experiences not only of the parent generation, but also of the children themselves. Now we're going to remark a little bit about the complexity of immigrant society. Something that I already mentioned with regard to Brownsville, but in fact this was true of any neighborhood in which Jews were living in large numbers. You had a variety, a tremendous diversity of institutions, clubs, businesses, different cultures, side by side, cheek by jowl. We start on the left with the famous popular music street that became nicknamed Tin Pan Alley because of the clamor, the noise created by all of the pianos playing these pop songs in these tiny little pop music offices. Tin Pan Alley is not on the Lower East Side, but it is located on West 28th Street, adjacent to the garment district of those days. And this is obviously not a Jewish institution, yet it was, as we know, populated by a very large percentage of Jewish artists and business people. It was also, and here I will refer back to the analogy with Brownsville, it was also, this popular music business, one of the early sites, as it were, where Jews and African Americans came together in common endeavor. They collaborated with each other on the business side or the artistic side or both. And it's something to be noted that during these early decades of the 20th century, one could speak in reference to the Jewish community and the Native American, the African American community, with some justification as two communities that were living in close proximity in neighborhoods or in places of work. But apart from these sort of informal sites where people came together, these neighborhoods also had religious institutions. Synagogues, of course, dotted the landscape, but not just synagogues. We have to take into account how the Jewish community inscribed its presence also with the building of institutions for health and welfare. Here you have the example of the Jewish hospital in Brooklyn, and the proliferation of such Jewish hospitals, which actually go back much earlier, but continued to proliferate as the pace of Jewish migration continued to grow. These Jewish hospitals obviously took their place in the city alongside many other hospitals that were being constructed, raised, and opened by other ethnic and religious communities. We should recall that public health in the United States, then as now, was not the major healthcare solution available. And church groups and synagogue groups and community groups made it their business to create the philanthropic understructure to provide basic healthcare and welfare services, not only to their own, but also to other residents. And in this way, once again, one can see the Jewish community changing the urban landscape by creating institutions, and yet these institutions, because they served a more general population and not just the Jewish population, could be said to also have been part of the integration process that Jews were involved in constantly. They were integrating themselves even as they were building institutions with Jewish names. The grassroots organization or institution that was most typically involved with the lives of immigrant Jews were the Landsmanshaftin, these hometown societies. Here I give you just one example, the Hungarian Sick Benefit Society. Often these Landsmanshaften started out as, in this case, a sick benefit society, that is to say, a health insurance society, an association to provide funds for families where the breadwinner or breadwinners may have fallen ill and in need of medical care. But these organizations, these hometown societies, became really multi-purpose associations serving not only philanthropic goals and self-help, but also they were for socializing. They provided their members not only with sick benefits, but with life insurance, what was known in the day as death benefits. They provided cemetery plots where people could be buried among their own rather than anonymously among the masses of the city's people. The numbers involved are critical to understand why there were so many separate institutions, organizations, and so forth, side by side, simultaneously. The Landsmanshaften alone, these hometown societies, each one of which was named for a place of origin in Europe. Sometimes, in this case, as you see, a Hungarian, a sort of a more general name, but most of the Landsmanshaften incorporated the name of a particular town. And in a sense, they brought the topography of Europe with them and inscribed that topography on the urban landscape of the big city, at least for a generation or two, with their names. There were 3,000 of these hometown societies, these Landsmanshaften, in New York City alone. And that was repeated in each and every big city where immigrant Jews settled. So that you can imagine, with 3,000 separate Landsmanshaften at work and active in Jewish neighborhoods around the city, one gets a sense that it was not possible to form one Jewish community. We're dealing with a population of Jews that grew up until 1914. It grew to 1.5 million Jewish residents in the city of New York. 1.5 million Jews, the largest single concentration of Jews in any city, indeed in any place on earth before then, and in many cases since then. It was more Jews than lived in most other countries. And the only places in the world that came, the places that came second and third after New York City with its 1.5 million Jews on the eve of World War I, we can give the example of Warsaw or Budapest, where there were 250,000 or 300,000 Jews living at roughly the same time. That is to say, New York City had 5 times as many as any other large Jewish urban center anywhere in the world at that time. And it's very clear that 1.5 million Jews cannot form one distinct community. They're too diverse, they're too many, and of course they have too many opinions. And so they formed small communities. And in that sense, the neighborhoods where people lived did function at one level as a kind of community, but it didn't exhaust the possibilities of how one constructed a community of like-minded people, people from similar backgrounds, people with similar goals and similar problems. And so these were crafted, as it were, out of the urban landscape. These were social units that existed by the people and for the people for at least a generation and sometimes more. Now, I mentioned that thinking about places, sites, and thinking about the Lower East Side, naturally we begin to think also of the importance of work. Now, as I said, the Lower East Side as such, after a while, was not a place of work, but in terms of manufacturing work. Most of the manufacturing, and here I'll talk specifically about the clothing industries, it's known as the needle trades, they had moved somewhat uptown. The kind of work that was still done at home, in the tenements, in places like the Lower East Side, that's what became known as sweatshops. That is, in basements, in cramped small rooms where people took in work that was outsourced, as we would say today, outsourced by garment manufacturers. They were not made in the factories. They were given to men and women to sew in some small space, sometimes even inside the living space where a poor family might be living, and of course earned the notorious and terrible name of sweatshops. But the factories themselves, when they were actually more well established, they were considered a step up, even though they were crowded, even though they were not what we would consider the state of the art. They were still considered a better option than the sweatshops. One of the sites that commemorates this era of the garment industry and the heavy concentration of Jews as workers in the garment trades is this sculpture that you see here in the slide, located on 7th Avenue between 39th and 40th, just at the sort of the northern edge of the garment district today. As you can see here, it was created by Judith Weller, known as the garment worker, but clearly, as you can see from the picture, it is the Jewish tailor who is being commemorated with this interesting 8-foot bronze sculpture. Now, work is not only how one makes a living. Work means also struggle. It means having to deal with long hours, low wages. A majority of the workers in the garment industry were women, and sometimes young girls, teenage girls of age 14 or 15. And they were paid very, very little. And so the world of work also became the world of politics, because workers began to form unions. They went out on strike. They had to struggle for their wages, for lowering the work week, eventually, after many, many years of struggle, to something resembling the 5-day work week that we know today. But back in the day, it was not uncommon for workers to work a 12-hour day, and there was no 2-day weekend. The picture on the left shows you an image from one of the clothing strikes with the banners that these young women are wearing, abolish slavery. They were not talking about slavery in the South in the Civil War. They were talking about wage slavery, meaning the pittance that they were being paid in the clothing factories. And in the Yiddish banner, once again, the same slogan, "Anider mit der Sklaverei," down with slavery. One of the sites around the city that is most famously associated with the hardships of the work of life, with the life of the working people, and particularly working women during that era. You see several views here. On the lower left, the way that the building looks today, the modern building on that site, but you will see in the other photos from 1911, the building that housed on one of the upper floors a factory known as the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, and hence the terrible fire and tragedy that took place there went down in history as the Triangle Fire, named for, as I say, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. It was one of the worst, if not the worst, tragedy of an industrial accident, as it were, in American history. 123 women and girls, mostly aged 14 to 23, as well as 23 men, died on March 25th, 1911, in a terrible fire that broke out in the factory. I said earlier that factories were considered a step up from sweatshops, and they were. To work in an inside factory, as they were called, was considered advantageous. And yet, even though there was ventilation and light compared to what one found in these tiny sweatshops in the cellars, and yet this was a place that was terribly crowded, and the doors were kept locked by the employers so that the workers would stay at their machines, at their workplace for the entire workday. And it was because the doors to the factory were locked that these 146 men and women were trapped. Some of them died there in the factory, and some of them died by jumping to their deaths. This became one of the crucial events in the history of labor legislation and industrial safety legislation in the city and the state of New York. The funerals of the victims of the Triangle Fire became mass political demonstrations, as you will see here in the photo on the left, where people of the city demonstrated vocally their protest against the horrible working conditions. The victims of the Triangle Factory were mostly Jews and Italians. And if before I had occasion to mention about Jews and blacks living side by side, sometimes even working, collaborating in certain parts of the working world, such as in the popular music industry. Here we have an example of Jews and Italians sharing the workplace in the garment factories of that day. And this event, as I said, became a catalyst for the passage of what at the time were radically new reforms regarding the safety at the workplace, ventilation, keeping the doors open and unlocked, and many, many other precautions which became standard practice in the manufacturing establishments of the United States. And it all really started, this wave of reform legislation started from this, this famous tragedy. The next bit along our itinerary concerns one of the important cultural figures, Sholem Aleichem, the pen name of Sholem Rabinovich. Most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with him, at least because some of Sholem Aleichem's Yiddish novellas became the source material that many, many years later was used to create Fiddler on the Roof. Sholem Rabinovich, or Sholem Aleichem, as he chose to call himself, Sholem Aleichem meaning Mr. Howdy Doody, how do you do? Sholem Aleichem was a well-known, popular Yiddish writer and playwright. He emigrated twice to the United States, once briefly in 1905, and then he came back towards the beginning of World War I. He died in New York in 1916 at a relatively young age. He was in his mid-50s. Sholem Aleichem lived in the Bronx at the time that he died. He's best known in his last years as the author of an unfinished novel, which was called Motel Pesi dem Chazens, Motel, the Cantor's Son. It was unfinished, but it became widely read. Motel Pesi dem Chazens is a story of the Jewish immigration from Russia, Ukraine, Poland, across Europe to Antwerp, from Antwerp overseas, over the Atlantic to New York. And it's a story that captures the two sides of Jewish culture, the before migration and after migration sides. Sholem Aleichem, as an immigrant himself, as an immigrant writer, artist, cultural figure, who tried very hard to make it in the Yiddish-speaking world of New York. And of course, he was given every respect, even adored, and yet his biography really demonstrates that somebody who was a superstar in Eastern Europe didn't necessarily make it quite as easily or quite as big in the setting of the metropolitan city. Some of his plays were not very successful, and so forth. So it's not as if he had it easy as a celebrity, living, as it were, high on the hog, pardon the expression, in New York City. And in fact, he fell ill. He died, as I say, at an early age. I want to show you something about Sholem Aleichem's decease and his burial. This is the tombstone engraving that he wrote, and he prepared it in advance for himself. You have it here with an English translation. The Yiddish says, "Da liegt a Yid aposheter," here lies a simple Jew. Sholem Aleichem, because of his persona, always projected himself as just one of the simple folk, a folksy kind of guy. Da liegt a Yid aposheter, geschrieben Jiddisch-Deutsch, für Weiber und für ein Prostenvolk hat Gewinn a Humorist, a Schreiber. He was a humorist. He was sometimes known as the Jewish Mark Twain, and so forth. And it goes on to describe how he was, despite being a humorist, nevertheless sorely plagued with problems. And this is possibly a hint at what I was saying a few minutes ago about the hard times that he was having in New York as an immigrant cultural figure, someone with a huge reputation, and yet not exactly making it still. And then he fell ill. Now, why am I telling you all of this? Because, again, our point is to ask, how did the Jews inscribe themselves on the urban scene, on the urban space? Sholem Aleichem's funeral in 1916 was one of the greatest mass outpourings of Jews of the city of New York that has ever been. More than 1 million people lined the streets of New York as his remains were carried in this horse-drawn carriage from his residence in the Bronx down through the entire length of Manhattan and across into Brooklyn to reach the cemetery, the Mount Carmel Cemetery, which lies just on the boundary line between Brooklyn and Queens. And you can imagine this funeral cortege accompanied by over 1 million Jews and, of course, with the customary police escort and so forth, lining the streets of New York, meandering its way down from borough to borough, down the major avenues, coming to a stop in front of the major Jewish institutions of that time, particularly in Manhattan and particularly in the Lower East Side, as if these were stations of pilgrimage. And it was, if you will, for that particular day, a taking over of the cityscape by the Jews of New York to honor their folk hero, their folk writer, who, in a sense, personified their lives and their culture and their aspirations. I should say that this was 1916. 14 years earlier, there had actually been another Jewish funeral that turned into a major fiasco. In 1902, one of the important Orthodox rabbis, Yaakov Yosef, who had been brought over from Lithuania to act as a kind of chief rabbi for a group of Orthodox synagogues, he died poor, sick, old, without a great deal of what we might call a proper station in life. The Jews of the city went out of their way to make up, as it were, for not giving Rabbi Yaakov Yosef what he deserved during his lifetime, and they planned a major funeral. Unfortunately, as it went through the streets of the Jewish quarter, it was pelted with stones. Hooligans came out to attack the people in the funeral procession. The police got involved and started hitting people right and left indiscriminately, whether they were trying to take part in the funeral or whether they were these people beating up on them. It was a fiasco, and that was 1902. And so if we contrast and compare the fiasco at the funeral of 1902 and this very dignified, very respectful, and very massive folk demonstration of Sholem Aleichem's funeral of 1916, we get a sense of how Jews had indeed changed the life of their city and inscribed their presence there. Now, to finish off, I'm going to take us back to Brownsville with a somewhat surprising story. Now, Brownsville, although Jews have left their mark on that neighborhood going back decades, nevertheless, for a long time already, Brownsville has not been a Jewish neighborhood. It has been mostly an African-American ghetto. And in fact, Brownsville was the site, or as it were, the staging area of one of the great crises in the city of New York, including a crisis between blacks and Jews. I mentioned earlier that there were instances in which one could talk about very comfortable or fairly comfortable coexistence and collaboration. Brownsville was once a neighborhood of diversity, and Jews and African Americans and others lived there more or less in a shared space. By 1968, this was no longer the case. In 1968, Brownsville, in fact, a larger district, a school district known as Ocean Hill, Brownsville. Those of you who are from New York will probably remember the major crisis in 1968, a clash between a group of militants who took over the school district at the invitation of New York City to inaugurate a plan for community control of the schools. And part of the community control that they asserted was to begin firing teachers who were veterans of the school district, many of whom were Jewish. And the New York City school system experienced a prolonged strike, teachers' strike, that lasted 3 months. It was not resolved until November. And Brownsville, in a sense, was ground zero of this tremendous clash between a black militant movement and the United Federation of Teachers, but not only that, the UFT, the United Federation of Teachers, headed by Albert Shanker and populated by a huge number of Jews in the education profession. This very quickly became a clash not just between a union and a small group asserting community control over the schools, but a clash that escalated or descended, depending on how you look at it, into hate speech directed against Jews on the one hand, but also a backlash against the black militants from the UFT and from the Jewish community at large. So this is what Brownsville had descended to, if you will, a place of conflict, a place of hatred, and of course, a place of great poverty. Now, years later, okay, we're moving forward from 1968, years later, in the 2000s, Brownsville has become one of many neighborhoods in New York City undergoing a program of gentrification, beautification, a way of lifting up the area from its bootstraps and trying to remake the neighborhood from an urban ghetto of poverty and struggle to something a little bit more resembling a livable residential neighborhood. And as part of the neighborhood beautification and improvement program, wall murals, very large wall murals, very colorful and artistic wall murals began to proliferate, were commissioned for buildings around the neighborhood. And here, at the corner of Pitkin Avenue and Herzl Street, which is the name Herzl Street, I think you should know, exists pretty much only in Israel and in Brownsville. Herzl Street, of course, is a reminder of when the Jews were once the solid majority of this neighborhood. So at the corner of Pitkin Avenue and Herzl Street, the wall mural that was put up says, "Welcome to Brownsville," up at the top of the mural, and then at the bottom, "It's not a dream, if you will it." For those of you who know something about Herzl, this is, of course, the dedication that he wrote to his novel of the beginning of the 20th century, Alt Neuland, the Old New Land, where he said in the famous slogan best known in Hebrew nowadays, Im tirtzu ein zo agada, if you will it, it is not a dream. And here you see our very own Herzl. I'm indicating him now with my pointer in this sort of blown up part of the slide. Here he is, Herzl, on the left-hand side of the mural as we face the mural, along with other local icons. All of the others come from African American culture. And Herzl, of course, is here being, as it were, adopted as a native son because of the name of the street, Herzl Street. But Herzl as a giver of a message of hope, innovation, and optimism. If you will it, it is not a dream. This is something that it's quite uncanny to see how this sort of quasi-Jewish influence of years and years ago becomes recycled into a new symbolic representation for the present-day residents who may or may not be aware of who Herzl was and what he has to do with the slogan that is emblazoned on this mural. We're going to pretty much end there for now so that I can leave time for questions. And let me just mention that next week we're going to carry on with the theme of monuments and memorials. And I hope to surprise at least some of you with a few places around New York City that you may actually not know about and not really all that familiar. So I'm going to stop here, hand on to you, Tamar, who, if you happen to have collected any questions for me. All right, then.
We have a few questions. First of all, thank you very much. That was fascinating. And I have to say the pictures of Sholem Aleichem's funeral are impressive. And thank you for sharing that with us. We have quite a few questions. I'm already apologizing. We don't usually have time for all of them, but we'll begin. Sarah Lehman wants to know, is it true that Jewish hospitals were set up because many public hospitals did not welcome Jewish patients or doctors?
Well, as I mentioned during the talk, there weren't that many public hospitals in those days. The governments of cities and states, let alone the federal government, that wasn't really under the mandate of the federal government, but local governments did begin to institute public hospitals in big cities, but they were few. They could not possibly handle the demand for health care, and most of the hospitals that were built in the United States were built with private philanthropic money, usually from church groups, and in the Jewish case, philanthropic associations that were formed precisely for that purpose. Now, the question, though, is a good question. Were Jews welcomed into Christian denominational hospitals, which, as I say, those were the majority of hospitals that were out there? And the answer is yes and no. I mean, you could obviously be treated in a hospital if you needed to. However, Christian hospitals, being Christian, generally had associations with the Christian religion. There were crosses on the wall. There may have been nuns attending to you, or there may have been Protestant missionaries coming in to visit you at your bedside to try and convince you that, you know, if you wanted to really save your soul, and who knows whether you were going to be getting out of that hospital alive, then you know, now might be a good time to consider. Of course, there was no question of receiving services such as kosher food in a Christian hospital. And therefore, Jewish hospitals very quickly became the Jewish answer to the need to provide the Jewish clientele or Jewish patients with health care in a more comfortable setting. By the way, in parentheses, not all Jewish hospitals agreed to provide kosher food for the patients. It just wasn't done because many of these Jewish philanthropists who paid for these hospitals didn't want anything to do with Orthodox Jewish tradition. Be that as it may, it is also true that these hospitals did provide jobs for Jewish physicians. And Jewish physicians began to face discrimination, and medical schools in the United States discriminated against Jewish medical students applying to medical school from about the 1910s through the 1930s and early 40s. So that there was a whole period of time in which if you were an aspiring doctor, or if you were already a physician, it was not quite so easy to obtain employment in, let's say, private Christian hospitals. Public hospitals were different, obviously. No discrimination took place there.
Okay. Hilla wants to know, he said you talked about the importance of work. Can you speak about the central role of Jews in the founding of the unions, or was that in the future session? No,
I'll be happy to address it now. I don't think it will come up next time.
Okay.
Yeah, this huge influx of migrants coming from Europe and from East Asia, pretty much at roughly the same period of American history, created a huge working class. But very often, people obtained work through the people that they knew. So that if you were a new immigrant and you didn't speak the language, the easiest way to get work was to get information from one of your fellow immigrants about where they work. And very often the person who employed you, if you got a job there, your boss was also a Jew, maybe with a few who had come earlier on and was already set up with a small business. So that these sort of internal networks that Jewish workers found their employment largely through Jewish social networks. And Italian workers also did the same with their Italian social networks. Now, when it came time for these workers who had it up to here with the brutal working conditions and the miserable wages, when they began to organize themselves, naturally they organized around the factory or workshop where they worked. And because of the social networking that created the workforce in those particular places of work, it was natural that the first unions grew up also on a kind of a ethnic basis. That is, Jewish workers formed unions with their fellow workers who were fellow Jews, Yiddish-speaking Jewish immigrants. Now, of course, once these small unions of a particular workplace caught on, they began to join up in collaboration with all of the other similar unions in the same industry. And that's where this sort of ethnic base, to begin with, was in a sense superseded by a class-based union framework. So like very large clothing workers unions like the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, the ILGWU, had Jewish workers, Italian workers, you name it. What is true is that many of the leaders of these large unions were veterans of the Jewish labor organizations. They had come up from the grassroots through the Jewish unions, and many of them remained at the top of the leadership structure of these big unions, such as the ILGWU. David Dubinsky was the head of the ILGWU, and similar things could be said for some of the other big garment unions. So that there was a cadre of union leaders who did come up through the ranks of Jewish union work.
Okay, I think we'll take one more last question. When did the mass migration of Jews out of Brownsville start? And what happened after the Holocaust?
Okay, well, those are, I guess, two separate questions. Brownsville, like any other neighborhood, is sort of like a train station. People are constantly going in and people are constantly going out. It's very rare that you see more than a generation going by without somebody moving out. In fact, it's much more the case that people would move after a certain number of years. Let's say between 5 and 15 years, it was very common for people to move around. either looking for better quarters within the neighborhood or indeed looking to other neighborhoods. And so the migration out of Brownsville was there all the time. What is interesting, though, is, of course, the net migration. When does it happen that more Jews are moving out than the number of Jews moving in? And that actually already begins to happen in the 1930s. There are more Jews moving out during the Depression than there are new Jews moving in, or other Jews moving in. And this has something also to do with the gradual change of the population of the neighborhood, and more African Americans are becoming local residents. By the time we get to the early 1960s, Brownsville is by and large a very heavy majority neighborhood of black people. And by the 1960s, most of the Jewish presence has shrunk very much. This is similar to what had happened earlier in Harlem, which back in the day was a center of German Jewish population. And as we know, by the 1910s and 20s, Harlem was already becoming a heavily concentrated black area, later as Hispanic as well. So this sort of dynamic happens in various neighborhoods around the city. Jews, meanwhile, by the time we see them moving out of places like Brownsville in large numbers, many of them are moving to the Bronx, some of them are moving to Queens, and some of them begin moving out to the suburbs by the time you get to the 1950s and 60s. The question about what happened after the Holocaust, I'm not exactly sure if this is connected to Brownsville or not, but yes, there are new Jews are arriving in America after the Holocaust survivors and war refugees, about 100,000, 120,000 all together. They didn't all decide to live in New York, but many of them did. And many of them did settle down in communities where many of the more longer established American Jews were already leaving. One of the Brooklyn neighborhoods where quite a number of Holocaust survivors did come to live is the case of the neighborhood of Canarsie, where Jews and Italians lived more or less together in the same neighborhood. And interestingly enough, both of those populations tried to resist the influx of black residents. The same thing was true in Queens, in an area called Forest Hills, where I happen to have been born, where, again, the city of New York came up with a plan to create low-cost, high-rise housing for people who no longer had room to live. And these were mainly black Americans or Hispanics, and they were going to, have this plan to build in Forest Hills, which was a middle-class neighborhood, more or less, to build these high-rise, new low-cost housing developments. And some of the people in Forest Hills, including some of the Jewish residents, including some of the Holocaust survivors who lived in that area, were not happy about it whatsoever. They had finally found a measure of safety and security in their new homes, and they did not want that to be changed. So, that, of course, is only one side of a much more complex story. But after the Holocaust is also when you get the influx of the Haredim, ultra-Orthodox survivors from various Hasidic communities or non-Hasidic ultra-Orthodox communities in places like Williamsburg and Crown Heights and various ultra-Orthodox groups coming after the Shoah, after the Holocaust, as survivors and as refugees, continuing to come up through the mid-1950s. Satmar Hasidim coming out of Hungary after the 1956 abortive Hungarian revolt and the Soviet repression of the Hungarian revolt of 1956. So once again, there's an influx of new Jewish immigrant population, and very often they do create strongholds in places, in neighborhoods that till this day feature those very strong concentrations of ultra-Orthodox Jewish groups.